Hey everyone, Green Orb here. I hope you're well. Today I'm going to be continuing the Sunday gaming series from last week with a follow-up on Shortest Trip to Earth. In the last week I've had some time to play it more, and really I have a bit of a guide on it and a lot more to say in a slightly shorter video than the one from last Sunday. To give you the too long didn't read version, I'm really enjoying this game. The replayability is very high thanks to the randomization of the different sectors, basically the world, and the different strengths and weaknesses of various ships. What you might have guessed from that is that it's a game based on a lot of luck ultimately. Unfortunately, you can play a really good game and kit your ship out really well, have great crew, have all the resources you need, good weapons, and you can still just get unlucky and run into one or two battles that really take you out of the fight and limit the chance of you actually reaching the final sector and reaching Earth. So I've played about 8 hours of the game so far, and 2 of the 5 runs that I had, I actually ended up with quite a good ship sort of by the end of Sector 3, only to run into a battle or series of battles that ultimately saw me eliminated from the game. Now that could be a function of the ship that I've been using, which is the starter ship, which is pretty good for the first few sectors but doesn't seem to be that strong in the later game. Or it could just be a function of luck at the end of the day. So, onto the game itself. The first thing that I will say is that you are going to spend a lot of time micromanaging your ship. In particular your crew, but a lot of effort is going to go into how you manage the different modules in your ship, how you upgrade the different slots, how many weapons you have, the mix of weapons and so on. One even simpler example is also assigning crew to the different slots. So you will spend a lot of time shuffling them around. You'll quickly learn that it makes a lot of sense to travel with crew in cryo sleep where you can, where you're not expecting combat. And actually the game does a really good job of letting you manage the templates. You can basically assign crews to slots and then save the template. And then let's say assign them back to cryosleep and save that as a separate template and then just load them as and when appropriate. So the game acknowledges that you're going to spend a lot of time micromanaging, especially the crew, but it does try to make it easy for you to do so. One little hint or tip is that your repair and your fire crew teams, normally these are drones, ideally you should place them in the middle of the ship, like the geometric center, because they can, certainly on the drone side, take quite a while to get to where they need to be. So having them in the middle is usually the most efficient place to put them. Otherwise they just randomly distribute themselves around the ship and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, onto combat. Combat is basically the key to this game. It's the place where you're going to make most of your resources and get most of your modules and potentially even some crew. And it's going to be the thing that if your ship is relatively good at, you will get to endgame. There's ultimately no way, I don't think, to get to endgame without engaging in a reasonable amount of combat. Now, tips and tricks here. The first and most important thing is your point defense. These are modules that shoot down incoming projectile weapons and enemy crew sent flying through space to board your ship. Some guides that I've read have said that you should or could go as high as 5-point defense. I've been running a ship with 2. Just to get me through the first few sectors, and it did okay, but past a certain point you are definitely going to want more. Then in terms of ship battles, as you can see here, point defense makes it quite easy to take on multiple enemies, especially if they're using lots of projectile weapons in place of energy weapons. Taking on 3 enemy ships normally is a recipe for death and destruction in this game, but you can see that this rat crew and the 3 ships didn't really stand a chance because they couldn't land any hits on me. In terms of attacking enemies, things to keep in mind, obviously disabling the enemy power generation is very important. If the ship doesn't have power, obviously their weapons don't function, and certainly later on in the game you'll find enemies that have extremely powerful energy weapons, and disabling the enemy power on the ship is actually more important than taking out the weapon itself. Since it obviously has a knock-on effect on multiple weapons. It's also quite useful to start fires on enemy ships, as this distracts the crew and requires people to repair things and generally takes away from their ability to fight. On your ship, it's obviously important to have as many weapons as you possibly can, but it is quite expensive to upgrade ship slots to get them to the point where you can reasonably have more than 4 weapons running at any one time, excluding your point defense. I will say the starter ship begins with 4 nuke tubes, and nukes are great, but they can be shot down by point defense quite easily, and they're extremely expensive in the early game to build, which makes them of limited use, probably even in the end game, to be honest. Also, sometimes you get into battles where enemy ships actually attack you from behind. You have no way of changing your ship, turning your ship around, so that can make the dynamics pretty interesting, because point defense are normally situated at the front, and most combat situations will presume a front-on attack. Just one thing for anyone who's getting into the game, remember that you can swap out modules virtually at will. So it's always useful to keep things like a med bay and a drone repair bay in your inventory and swap them into your ship when you need them. You can swap that out for, say, the science bay or something else that's not really critical. And obviously then just quickly heal your crew and your bots, and then replace them with whatever you had in that slot before. You can also move modules around during combat, although there is a time penalty to that, so it's not ideal. Also, as you're moving through the game, you should also try find modules which let you replace, let's say, 2 power modules with a single one. Obviously this frees up space to install other modules, as well as to upgrade to weapons units. Power modules are the one obvious target for this, although the more power you have, the better you can survive in combat. But storage modules are another great example. There is one downside to concentrating power in your storage. If the enemy lands a lucky shot, you can find yourself either without any power for your weapons in the whole ship, or having lost a lot of resources, which can make it really difficult to finish off the game. It is important to explore as widely as possible, especially in the early sectors. You should ideally be visiting every point in the sectors and exploring it entirely. It makes it quite easy to pick up good upgrades for your ship, as you'll often be landing up in relatively easy combat. And lots of combat means lots of materials and money, which you will need later game. One thing you will notice from this is material management quickly becomes very important. The best way to approach this that I've found is to keep a certain amount of free space. So you should never be flying around at 100% storage for something. If you are flying around at 100% capacity, you should try land at a space station and then sell off that excess down to, say, 60% full. This will obviously give you credits, and make sure that you don't ever have to dump additional resources or convert to fuel, which is really inefficient. You can obviously create resource packs, but that costs a fair bit of fuel and it's not very efficient. One thing to keep in mind is just keep an eye out for stations selling at a full price for resources. You'll see what I mean very quickly when you play the game. Ideally, you'll sell more of those resources to the station for credits. It's not that common to come across a sort of situation where they will buy from you at full price. In terms of modules and scrapping modules, you will spend a lot of time scrapping modules. There are a lot of weapons that are just simply not worth it. There are a lot of modules that you'll find that have already been superseded by ones that you have installed. General rule when you scrap these modules is that scrap those ones that give you resources that you don't have a lot of. Again, working towards not ever being 100% full of any resource. You might also encounter instances where the odd module is actually worth more as scrap than what it costs you to buy in terms of credits. So as an example, some modules may cost you, let's say, 300 credits, but return to you 3 or 4 exotics, which usually sell for pretty much anything from 35 up to 60 credits, plus then a decent bundle of other resources. So sometimes it's good to buy the module and then immediately scrap it. The only other thing that really bears mentioning from my playthrough is just in terms of organics, otherwise known as food. These become a real pain to start to manage when you have a slightly larger crew. The best way to offset the organics requirements is to, one, keep a lot of crew in cryo sleep during movement, so that's when there's no chance of combat, but like when you perhaps warp into a new system. There will generally be quite a good chance that you'll land somewhere where there's an enemy ship that immediately targets you and you won't have time to get crew out of cryo sleep. And the other way is to assign your human crew, especially those that have really high food requirements, to the organics making modules. Two benefits to this: one, you get they obviously make organics for the rest of the crew, but also when they're in those modules, they don't their organics consumption is 0, so it becomes a real benefit. And then obviously during or just before combat, you can assign them to the new posts. That's pretty much it in terms of tips and tricks. The rest of the game does cover pretty well. I will say this is a real game of experimentation. The reality is, the more I've played, the more I've found sort of interesting ways to play this game. And because of the replayability, because of the randomization, I can see I'm going to be playing this quite a lot more in the future. Obviously, I do want to try and actually get a ship to Earth, finish it via Sector 10. And at the moment I'm actually only on Sector 4 of 10, so I'm going to keep trying until I get there. That is it for today, however. Next Sunday I will be picking up a different unplayed game from my Steam library, and either going through the tutorial and some gameplay, or just diving straight into the gameplay. So tune back in next week for the next Sunday Gaming Series video. Thanks so much for watching.